Hi, the poem we're going to look at today is Cozy Apologia by Rita Dove. As I've done previously, I've tried to give you some images to capture the key moments in the poem for you. I've given you a knight in shining armour, overlaid with an everyday item here of a lamp. I've given you a picture of a hurricane with its hollow centre clearly visible. And I've given you the two words everyday happiness and this idea with a smile underneath, showing it as a positive image. Okay, if you already know this poem, pause the video now and without your notes answer these three questions. And then when you've answered them, restart the video and check your answers. This is a great revision technique to self-test. And this helps secure some of the knowledge in your long-term memory, so it's there for you to use when you hit that GCSE exam. Okay, let's get on with the poem. First, a couple of tips. Pause the video regularly and take notes throughout. Use the layout on the next slide to structure your notes. And if you find them useful, take the images and to assist that solidification of the ideas in your long-term memory. And remember, test yourself regularly. It's the best revision technique. So here's the layout I suggest. This will give you enough to write about these poems in the GCSE exam. It does not cover every aspect of the poem by any means, but it will give you enough to write about in both your poetry essays in the exam. Okay, the context of this poem. Rita Dove is an African-American black poet, and she married a German writer called Fred Vebern. Their relationship has been very long-lasting and very settled. However, they did both receive criticism about their choice of partner in the early days of their relationship. The poem is a tribute to both him and their relationship, and therefore is autobiographical. You should also note that in 1999 there was a Hurricane Floyd, and it did actually strike the United States, where it caused a lot of flooding and a lot of destruction. And this use of this real hurricane, the name of the real hurricane in the poem, adds to this sense of realism, this idea of a realistic portrayal of love rather than it being a fantasy. Okay, the first thing I'd like to draw attention to is that the poem has a dedication. It's the only one of our 18 poems that does this. It says it's for Fred. And this dedication makes the poem personal and realistic from the very start. It is to and about a real person. Not a fantasy, not an ideal, but an actual person. So you can make that point very early on, that Rita Dove is concerned with a realistic portrayal of a relationship. Okay, let's look at stanza 1. I could pick anything and think of you, this lamp, the wind still rain, the glossy blue my pen exudes, drying matte upon the page. I could choose any hero, any cause or age, ensure as shooting arrows to the heart, astride a dappled mare, legs braced as far apart as standing in silver stirrups will allow, there you'll be, with furrowed brow and chainmail glinting to set me free, one eye smiling, the other firm upon the enemy. Now I've highlighted two different fields of words, two different topics here. First of all, we've got these words highlighted in yellow about everyday objects. A lamp, the rain, the blue ink on the page. Okay, and these things, all these items remind her of her husband. Not fantasy items, everyday things that she can see in front of her. She doesn't have to look far to find things that make her feel close to her husband. But she contrasts this with this language about heroism or knights in shining armour. We've got a hero, astride a dappled mare, silver stirrups and chainmail glinting. What we see here is that Dove shows us that everyday things remind her of her husband, and yet to her he is a hero. He is her knight in shining armour. Okay, and she says that it's sure and certain. He will always be there for her, reliable. He will always be her hero. So there's your first point. Everyday items remind her of her husband, but to her, he is a hero, a knight in shining armour, and we can pick out the language which shows us that. And I've given you the image of a knight and the image of the lamp, the everyday object that reminds her that he is her knight in shining armour. First language point then, very straightforward. Okay, your second language point is in stanza 2, and we pick out this idea of a hurricane, and it is Hurricane Floyd. We've already discussed that in the context, but it reminds her, she has daydreams or reminiscences, memories, it reminds her of teenage relationships. Now, why would a hurricane be a suitable metaphor or analogy for a teenage relationship? Well, hurricanes are linked to teenage relationships because hurricanes are chaotic and exciting when you're in them, but they don't last very long, and ultimately they leave behind nothing but chaos and destruction. And that's what Rita Dove's drawing our attention to in immature or teenage relationships. They're exciting, they're like a whirlwind romance, to use another link to a hurricane. We know that phrase, a whirlwind romance, but ultimately they don't last. They're not substantial, they're not certain, and they leave behind nothing but destruction. And here she describes the boys who she was involved with as sweet, but with a hollow centre. There's nothing in them. They're all about the external idea just of the kissing, rather than anything more substantial to think about. So there's your second language point, this idea that a hurricane represents a teenage relationship. Exciting, but short-lived and destructive. And there's your image to jog your memory of that. Now in stanza 3, she starts to again draw these contrasts. We have these words that say we're content, that they're satisfied, and that their relationship is ordinary and it's not worthy of the news. And she contrasts that with this idea of the divine. Their love is shown as this everyday event. It's ordinary and satisfying rather than ecstatic and heavenly. And this contrasts with this idea of divine love or heavenly love, Cupid, Valentine's Day, and this idea of this fantasy of love where it's absolute perfection all the time. And Duff shows us that she's content. We're content. We're satisfied. We don't need any more. And we see that Dove has this idea of the real love being more important than this image or imagination of love. And I've given you this idea of everyday happiness is what counts, rather than this, this fantasy of love that we might see in movies. Okay, let's move on to structure. And I've picked out the first and last lines of the poem. And she says that she thinks of him in the opening line, and she says she fills this stolen time with him in the closing line. So the structure here shows the poem begins and ends with thoughts of her husband. In fact, the word you, the person the poem's dedicated to. Thoughts of you, thoughts of Fred. It begins and ends with these thoughts. The structure shows he is the first and last thing she thinks about. Okay, he's there all the time for her, at the beginning and at the end. The thoughts in the middle, in stanza 2, they interrupt that for a while, but it's going to end with her thoughts of him. Look, in the final word of the poem, it's back to Fred. So there's your first structure point, the opening and closing lines. The second structure point deals with the rhyme, and if we look at the opening stanza, we've got the rhyme words of you, blue, page, age, heart, apart, allow, brow, free, and enemy. We've got this rhyming couplets. A very traditional way of writing about love in rhyming couplets. And then at the end of the poem we have a regular rhyme scheme again. This time it's not couplets, it's an ABAB rhyme scheme, but we see in the last 4 lines of the poem news and blues. and do and you. So again, the rhyme scheme is very regular and very structured. And we see that when she's thinking about her husband in stanza 1 and at the end of stanza 3, the rhyme scheme is regular. There's structure there, there's certainty and security. However, when she's talking about teenage relationships in the middle here, and she's talking about the hurricane, we see that the rhyme scheme is chaotic and erratic. It's not regular. You can't rely on it like you can't rely on teenage boys or teenage relationships. So again, the structure ties in nicely to the meaning of the poem. So there's your second structure point, looking at the rhyme scheme. So Dove's thoughts and feelings. She shows us that what we should value about love is what is genuine and real, instead of the ideas of love that we're shown in the media, in romantic comedies, in this idea of perfect relationships. Dove shows us that mature relationships are more stable. You can rely on them like you can rely on the rhyme scheme, rather than unreliable teenage relationships with this idea, this fantasy idea of love. It makes clear to the reader that what is important about a relationship is everyday happiness. And the reader's encouraged to value stability and consistency and someone who is reliable instead of this fantasy idea of love. You might contrast this with Sonnet 43, which has an idealised representation of love in a very traditional poem, and we'll come on to that in some future poems. I hope this has been useful and takes you through Rita Dove's poem, Cosy Apologia.